You know, when you watch a master watchmaker at work, everything looks incredibly serene from the outside, right?
Oh, yeah, completely calm.
Exactly. You just see this like smooth, continuous sweep of the second hand on the dial.
Hmm.
But if you were to actually take a microscopic screwdriver, pry off the back casing and look inside, well, you would see a profoundly chaotic environment.
Right, a high-tension environment.
Yeah. You'd find hundreds of these tiny interlocking gears and microscopic springs that are just coiled to their absolute physical limit, constantly grinding against each other just to maintain that outward facade of stable timekeeping.
It's basically a controlled collision of forces. And, I mean, the tension is the point. If just one of those tiny gears slips even a fraction of a millimeter, or, if one spring loses its tension, the entire mechanism seizes up.
The clock just stops dead.
Exactly.
And we so often look at global politics through that exact same lens, especially when we talk about the Nordic countries.
Oh, for sure. The Scandinavian utopia trope.
Right. As external observers, we see this sleek, minimalist exterior. We see, the top rankings on global happiness indexes, the robust social safety nets.
It's really smooth functioning of a highly digitized society.
Yeah, we see the clean face of the watch. But then you lift the casing. And right now, if you look at the actual mechanics of what is happening inside Denmark, we are looking at a political and geopolitical landscape that is, quite honestly, vibrating with dangerous levels of tension.
It is the absolute definition of a high-tension mechanism right now. I mean, the external pressures are immense, and the internal realignments are just, well, they're unlike anything we've seen in modern Scandinavian history.
Welcome, everyone, to this Extra Diplomacy and International Relations edition of the show. Today, we are undertaking a massive deep dive into a genuinely historic moment, which is the recent Danish general election held just days ago on March 24th, 2026.
But we aren't just looking at local politics here.
No, not at all. We are examining the profound, almost tectonic ripple effects this election is sending across global geopolitics. So if you're someone fascinated by international relations and, the hidden levers of international politics, you are absolutely in the right place.
And if you are finding this kind of detailed analysis valuable, we'd really love for you to follow and subscribe. You also have the option to subscribe on Spotify or Apple Podcasts for a small monthly fee.
Yeah, that direct support really helps keep this operation running, and it gives you access to our entire library of extra content. Yeah. The link for that is right down there in the description.
So what exactly are we unpacking today?
Well, our mission is to analyze a really fascinating stack of sources we've gathered. We want to understand how a nation of just 6 million people is completely rewriting its political DNA.
Right, because they are navigating some huge forces.
Massive forces. We are pulling from comprehensive academic overviews, specifically the Danish Foreign Policy Review 2025, which is published by the Danish Institute for International Studies.
Which is a fantastic resource.
It really is. And we're integrating real-time election monitoring transcripts from the European Policy Center, detailed geopolitical intelligence reports from Stratfor, and on-the-ground newsletters like last week in Denmark.
So we have a really broad spectrum of data.
Yeah, and the goal is to figure out how Denmark is navigating the crushing and honestly often contradictory demands of the United States and the European Union.
While also fundamentally restructuring their own society just to survive an era of unprecedented global uncertainty.
Exactly. But before we get into the weeds, we need to make something very clear.
Yes. This is crucial to state up front, especially given the nature of the sources we are unpacking today. The material we are covering contains highly politically charged content.
Extremely charged.
We are going to be discussing policies that span the absolute extremes of both left-wing and right-wing ideologies. So we want to be explicitly clear to you, the listener.
Right.
We are not taking any sides here.
Not at all.
We are not endorsing the viewpoints, the political strategies, or the ideologies contained in this content. Our job is simply to impartially report on the ideas, the data, and the events documented in the original source material.
We just want to help you understand the massive forces currently at play. So let's set the immediate scene. To truly understand Denmark's global maneuvering, we have to look at the domestic political earthquake that literally just happened.
Right, the snap election.
Yeah, Prime Minister Mette Frederiksen called a snap election on February 25, 2026. The results came in on March 24, and the outcome is incredibly, historically fractured.
So it's a completely shattered landscape.
If you look at the raw numbers, her party, the Social Democrats, came in first. but they only secured 21% of the vote.
Which translates to 38 seats in the Folketing, the Danish parliament.
Right, and to put that 21% into historical context.
Yeah, this is the wild part. That represents a loss in 12 seats for them. It is actually the Social Democrats' worst electoral result since 1903.
Wait, 1903? Like early 20th century.
Exactly. Think about the gravity of that date. For a party that has historically been the unquestioned bedrock of the Danish political system, I mean, they are the very architects of the Nordic welfare state model.
Right, throughout the whole 20th century.
Yeah. So a result like this is just a staggering psychological blow.
But I want to push back on the idea that this was just, a rejection of the left. Because the sources show it wasn't just the left taking a hit. The collapse of the traditional powers happened on the right, too.
Oh, absolutely. The center-right party, Venstre.
Which, confusingly for non-Danish speakers, literally translates to left, even though they are the liberal free market center-right party.
Right, exactly. Well, they suffered their absolute worst electoral result in their 146-year history.
146 years. That is unbelievable.
This is what makes this election an actual earthquake. It's not just a swing of the pendulum from left to right. It's a shattering of the pendulum itself. We are looking at unprecedented fragmentation.
Because there are now 12 different parties entering the Danish parliament, right?
12. And 11 of those 12 parties polled below 12% of the total vote.
That is just a massive spread.
To understand how radical this shift is, the European Policy Center monitors point out that if you look back to the year 2001, the two main parties, the Social Democrats and Venstre, held over 60% of the vote combined.
They were the twin pillars of Danish politics.
But today, after this 2026 election, those two historic heavyweights hold just 32% together.
Wow. And the analysts in our think tank reports, they're calling this the Hollandization of Danish politics, right?
Yeah, referencing the Netherlands.
Right, which is a country traditionally known for extreme multi-party fracturing, mostly because of their pure proportional representation system. I mean, in the Netherlands, you often need 4, 5, or sometimes 6 parties just to form a working bare majority government.
And Denmark has officially arrived at that level of intense fragmentation.
And this creates a monumental, almost mathematically impossible coalition puzzle. The Folketing has 179 seats. The magic number you need to secure a governing majority is 90. Right now, according to the final tallies, the left-wing bloc collectively holds 84 seats. The right-wing bloc collectively holds 77 seats.
So nobody has the 90.
Exactly. Neither the traditional left nor the traditional right can form a government on its own without crossing the aisle or making massive concessions.
Because of this fracture, we have to look closely at who actually capitalized on the chaos. The Danish People's Party, which is a far-right nationalist party, they surged to 9.1% of the vote.
They secured 16 seats, right?
Yeah, which is a massive 11-seat increase from the previous election.
So how did they pull that off when everyone else was losing ground?
According to the EPC transcripts, they achieved this by campaigning aggressively and almost exclusively on cost of living and inflation anxieties.
That's right.
They didn't just talk about abstract economics. Their leader, Morten Messerschmidt, was literally out at gas stations handing out discounted gas to drivers.
Wow, that's a very direct tactic.
Very direct. He visibly tied global economic pressures, the cost of heating a home, filling a tank, directly to the perceived failures of the centrist establishment.
But while the extremes gain ground, the true pivot point, the ultimate kingmaker in this entire complex scenario, is a man named Lars Løkke Rasmussen and his moderates party.
Yes. They secured 7.7% of the vote, which gives them 14 highly strategic seats.
And to understand his role, you really have to know his background. I mean, Rasmussen is a former prime minister himself, having previously led the Venstre party.
Right, then he broke away.
Yeah, he formed his own centrist party and actually served as the outgoing foreign minister under Frederiksen's most recent cross-aisle coalition government.
What's wild to me, reading through the Stratfor intelligence reports, is that Rasmussen's party was polling dangerously low just a few months ago.
Really? How low?
In December, they were hovering below the 2% threshold. And in Denmark, if you don't hit 2%, you get 0 seats in parliament. You are entirely wiped off the board.
Oh, wow. So how on earth did he survive and bounce back to nearly 8% when his larger coalition partners took historic beatings?
He survived through sheer, highly visible statesmanship. During the recent international crises that precipitated this snap election, Rasmussen basically positioned himself as the calm, rational, experienced adult in the room.
Interesting.
When tensions flared globally, particularly regarding the friction between the United States and Greenland, which we are definitely going to dissect in detail shortly, Rasmussen didn't panic or grandstand.
He just went straight to work.
Exactly. He traveled directly to Washington, D.C. He met with key figures in the current U.S. administration, including J.D. Vance and Marco Rubio, and maintained a remarkably steady diplomatic hand.
And the voters rewarded that.
Yeah, the Danish voters who were highly anxious about these geopolitical threats, they rewarded that stability. His actions protected the moderates from the severe electoral punishment that voters handed out to the Social Democrats and Venstre.
So now Denmark enters this incredibly quirky, deeply traditional process known as the King's Round.
Oh, this is a fascinating tradition.
It really is. King Frederick X, who recently took the throne, plays a formal constitutional role here. He hosts the party leaders at the palace.
Each of the 12 party leaders goes to the monarch.
Right. And they advise him on who should be appointed as the royal investigator to try and form a government. And Rasmussen, holding those 14 crucial centrist seats, is basically sitting right in the middle of this chaos, holding all the cards.
He is, but he has drawn some very clear red lines. He refuses to base any government on the mandates of the far-left parties, and he vehemently refuses to rely on the far-right Danish People's Party.
What's his reasoning for that?
His explicit reasoning, as noted in the sources, is that the Danish People's Party advocates for policies that would violate international migration conventions. And, as a former foreign minister focused on international law, he views that as a total non-starter.
Reading through these election reports, I keep visualizing this 12-party system as a massive, constantly shifting Rubik's Cube.
That's a great way to look at it.
Yeah, like you try to solve the red side. Let's say you're trying to get an agreement on progressive environmental policy. But in the process of twisting the rows to get the red squares to line up, you completely scramble the blue side, which represents, say, migration policy or economic reform.
Every single twist alienates a different faction.
Exactly.
Yep.
But let me challenge this setup for a second. Imagine you are a Danish voter, right? You live in a small country of 6 million people. You are watching an aggressive Russia to your east and dealing with an incredibly demanding, unpredictable America to your west.
It's a tough spot.
Very. So does this extreme domestic fragmentation paralyze the country? Does having 12 voices screaming in Parliament destroy a small nation's ability to execute a coherent foreign policy? Or does it, perversely, force a more stable, centrist consensus because the extremes simply cancel each other out?
That is the pivotal question of Danish governance right now. And the answer, drawn from the academic consensus in our sources, is that the fragmentation does not cause paralysis on the existential issues.
Really? So they can still function on the big stuff?
Surprisingly, yes. On the big questions, security, foreign policy, NATO alignment, there is actually a remarkable, rock-solid consensus in the Danish center. But how that center has managed to hold together is a fascinating story of political engineering. Because to maintain that center, Prime Minister Mette Frederiksen had to essentially blow up the traditional ideological spectrum.
Which perfectly sets up the next crucial piece of this deep dive. Because to understand how Frederiksen survived this election at all, even with historic losses, we have to look at her domestic survival strategy over the past several years.
Quite the strategy.
Yeah. To maintain power in this chaotic, Hollandized environment, Mette Frederiksen engineered what the political scientists in our sources describe as a radical ideological hybrid.
It is a strategy that fundamentally rewrites the entire playbook for European social democracy.
Let's unpack that, because usually the left is struggling right now.
Exactly. If you look across Europe over the last decade, much of the traditional left has collapsed. Political scientists call it PASOKification, named after the Greek Socialist Party PASOK that practically vanished.
Right, because working-class voters just abandoned center-left parties in droves.
Right. But Frederiksen survived by deliberately, proactively, and unapologetically adopting hard-right immigration policies.
Wait, hard-right immigration policies from a center-left leader?
Yes. And she did it specifically in order to protect the traditional left-wing Nordic welfare state.
They call it the welfare first doctrine, right?
Yes, that's the term.
The logic she presents to the voters is incredibly blunt, and it goes something like this. Denmark has an extraordinarily generous, high-quality public service system. It relies on extremely high taxes, but in return, citizens get free health care, free university education, subsidized childcare, robust unemployment benefits.
It's the classic Nordic model.
Exactly. And she asserts that this high-trust system can only survive financially and socially if immigration, particularly from non-Western countries, is strictly limited to those who fully share the economic and cultural compact of the nation.
Now, if you step back and look at the broader historical context, this was rhetoric that 10 or 15 years ago was exclusively the domain of the populist, anti-immigrant right in Europe.
It's totally taboo for the left.
It was considered entirely taboo for a mainstream social democratic party, but Frederiksen took that taboo rhetoric and formalized it into official social democratic doctrine.
And it wasn't just talk. The sources provide a highly detailed, neutral accounting of the remarkably strict asylum regimes her successive governments have implemented since 2019 to achieve this.
Yeah, let's walk through the mechanics of these policies exactly as the think tanks report them, because the scope and legal creativity involved is just vast.
Right. First, her government actively explored offshoring the entire asylum processing system. They looked into formal agreements with third countries, most notably Rwanda.
So they wouldn't even process them in Denmark.
Exactly. The idea was that if an asylum seeker arrived in Denmark, they wouldn't be processed there. They would be flown to Rwanda while their case was reviewed.
They also introduced the concept of return hubs, which would be located completely outside the borders of the European Union, specifically for rejected asylum seekers.
Wow.
And they dramatically tightened the legal requirements for family reunification. They even instituted a policy where residency permits for refugees could be actively revoked if the Danish government determined that the security conditions in their home countries had sufficiently improved.
Like in the certain regions of Syria, right?
Yes, exactly like Syria. And this applied regardless of whether the refugees had already built a life in Denmark.
And perhaps the most complex and legally controversial of these policies is what became known as the ghetto plan.
Oh, this one is really intense.
According to the sources, this involved legally defining certain vulnerable neighborhoods based on specific metrics. Like, they looked at the percentage of non-Western immigrants, local crime rates, and unemployment levels.
And then what happened to those neighborhoods?
Well, once a neighborhood was designated with this label, the state could actually double the legal prison sentences for certain crimes committed within those specific geographical zones.
Wait, really? Double the sentence?
Yeah. So a crime committed on one side of the street could carry twice the penalty of the exact same crime committed 3 blocks away.
That is legally wild. And the overarching philosophy behind all of these distinct mechanisms was crystallized when her own immigration minister explicitly stated that the ultimate political goal of the government was 0 asylum seekers.
0. That's a very clear goal.
It is. And again, it is vital to remember this isn't a right-wing coalition enacting these laws. This is the center-left Social Democrats pushing this through Parliament.
And we really have to look at the cold, hard electoral mathematics of why they did this. By completely stealing the far right's thunder on the incredibly potent issue of borders and migration, Frederiksen essentially neutralized the traditional threats to her party.
Right.
Like in places like France or the UK, working class and lower middle class voters abandoned the left because they felt progressive parties were elitist and ignoring their anxieties about cultural change, integration, and wage competition.
They felt left behind.
Yeah. Frederiksen essentially looked at those voters and said, we hear your anxieties and we will put our people first.
And from a purely tactical standpoint, it worked for a long time. The working class rewarded her approach, allowing her to build a durable, cross-class coalition that kept her in the Prime Minister's office where other European leftist leaders were wiped out.
But it requires an incredibly delicate balancing act.
No, extremely delicate. Because you can't just be tough on borders. If you are the Social Democrats, you still have to deliver on the left-wing economic promises that your base expects.
Exactly. The strict borders are just the defensive wall. Inside the wall, she deployed classic bread-and-butter left-wing economic policies.
Like what?
For example, she proposed a new wealth tax, specifically designed to increase funding for public education and elder care welfare.
Ah, okay. And the timing of this snap election meant she was also dealing with intense economic pressure from external events.
Right. The global economy was shaky.
Yeah, the geopolitical reports mention high inflation fueled by the war in Iran, which, in the timeline of these 2026 sources, is causing global energy markets to panic.
That translates to housing and winter heating costs just spiking for the average person in Copenhagen.
Exactly. So Frederiksen immediately promised to intervene with direct state support for food and heating to protect the most economically vulnerable. She campaigned on macroeconomics, but also hyperlocal welfare issues.
Right down to legislating better animal welfare standards for farm pigs to appease the agricultural and environmental sectors.
It's a very comprehensive approach.
I keep visualizing this strategy as building a medieval fortress. Like she is forcefully drawing up the drawbridge, representing these incredibly strict immigration policies to aggressively protect the treasury inside, which is the welfare state.
That's a very vivid analogy.
But here's where I have to question the long-term viability of this. Is this hybrid model, this fortress building, a genuinely sustainable blueprint for the future of European politics? Or is it just a precarious high-wire act? Doesn't she risk constantly alienating the progressive urban left-wing base of her party while forever chasing right-wing talking points just to stay one step ahead of the populist parties?
Well, the analysis from the European Policy Center indicates that it is, in fact, both.
Both.
Yeah, it is an exhausting high-wire act, but it might be the only sustainable blueprint for European social democrats in the current era.
I see.
The analysts note a deep polarization in how she is viewed. I mean, critics call her leadership style authoritarian and her policies draconian, while supporters call it necessary, pragmatic leadership in a dangerous world.
But the numbers kind of prove it works, right?
Yeah. The raw numbers tell the story. Even though she lost 12 seats in the snap election, her ability to hold on to 21% of the vote and remain the dominant political force after 7 grueling years in power navigating a pandemic, a war in Ukraine, a war in the Middle East, and historic inflation, it proves that this welfare-first cross-pollination is incredibly resilient.
So we've explored how Denmark has spent the last several years building this ideological fortress around its domestic welfare state. But as any historian will tell you, a fortress is completely useless if the ground beneath it is crumbling.
That is very true.
You cannot protect your domestic treasury if you cannot secure your physical borders against external military threats. And for Denmark, the ground beneath their feet has historically been secured by one very specific entity, the United States.
And that is the crucial pivot. The Danish Foreign Policy Review 2025 features a brilliant, extensive analysis by scholars like Sten Rinning into Denmark's strategic culture.
And they outline a massive shift, don't they?
A generational evolution in how Denmark views the global stage and the use of military force. If we go back to the Cold War, Denmark practiced what was known academically as adaptation.
Or sometimes derisively called footnote policy, right?
Exactly. They were a NATO member, yes, but a quiet, somewhat hesitant one. They often added footnotes to NATO communiques expressing reservations about nuclear deployments.
And in the 90s, after the Soviet Union fell, they focused heavily on UN peacekeeping missions in places like the Balkans.
But after the September 11 attacks in 2001, under then Prime Minister Anders Fogh Rasmussen, the Danish mindset underwent a radical transformation.
They decided to become a quote-unquote strategic actor, and they adopted a foreign policy doctrine that academics explicitly label super-Atlanticism.
Super-Atlanticism, it's quite a term.
Let's break down how that actually functioned in reality. What it meant was that Denmark began using its own military force as a form of geopolitical currency.
Interesting. How so?
They consciously decided to spend Danish blood and Danish treasure to buy influence, goodwill, and rock-solid, unquestionable security guarantees from Washington, D.C.
They wanted to be what's called an entrepreneurial ally. Denmark realized that as a small nation, they couldn't compete on total troop numbers or massive defense budgets, so they competed on willingness and lack of caveats.
Meaning they wouldn't put restrictions on how their troops could be used.
Exactly. They wanted to be seen by the U.S. military establishment not just as another European country complaining about defense burdens, but as a premier top-tier partner willing to fight on the front lines.
They did it work.
This strategy was highly successful in granting them disproportionate access to confidential American intelligence and elevating their diplomatic status high above other European nations of similar size.
But the toll of that strategy was immense, and it was deeply felt at home. I mean, for a nation of just 6 million people, the sacrifice of super-Atlanticism was highly visible.
Yeah, fighting alongside the U.S. and the U.K. in the hardest provinces of Iraq and Afghanistan, Denmark lost 44 soldiers, with 37 of them killed in direct action.
If you adjust that for population size, it is an immense, tragic sacrifice. It was a heavy price paid for a geopolitical relationship.
And that profound historical reliance, that intense multi-decade need to keep Washington happy and engaged, collided spectacularly with the immediate geopolitical crisis that actually triggered this snap election in early 2026.
Right. Donald Trump's renewed aggressive public desire to acquire Greenland.
Yeah. This is where global geopolitics sounds like science fiction, but it is incredibly real and incredibly urgent for Denmark.
For context, for those who might not know, Greenland is an autonomous territory within the Kingdom of Denmark. It has its own government for domestic affairs, but Denmark handles its foreign policy and security.
And suddenly, the U.S. president is openly signaling he wants to buy it.
Mette Frederiksen's public response was blunt, immediate, and broadcast globally. She stated unequivocally, Greenland is not for sale.
Which, as we noted when looking at the election numbers earlier, gave her a massive rally around the flag bump in the domestic polls. It shot her approval rating from 17% up to nearly 21% almost overnight.
The Danish public fully supported her defiance of the American president.
But beneath that very loud public posturing, the think tank sources reveal a fascinating high-stakes layer of secret parallel diplomacy.
Exactly. Because you can't just slam the door and hang up the phone on your primary security guarantor, especially when Russia is rebuilding its military next door.
Right, you need them.
While the politicians were talking tough for the cameras and social media, civil servants from Denmark, the Greenlandic government, and the United States were meeting very quietly, far away from the press, to de-escalate the situation.
The European Policy Center transcripts provide incredible detail on this working group. It was led by the head of the Danish Foreign Service and his Greenlandic counterpart, holding discrete meetings with American defense and State Department officials.
And what was their strategy?
Their entire strategy was tactical delay. They wanted to slow the political process down, keep the inflammatory rhetoric off the radar, and find a highly technical, bureaucratic solution to appease the U.S. military's actual strategic needs without conceding a single inch of sovereign territory.
And we saw the actual results of that secret back-channeling emerge during a U.S. Senate hearing. General Gregory Guillot, the head of U.S. Northern Command, testified that the U.S. military's primary objective wasn't real estate acquisition.
Oh, then what was it?
It was to expand early warning radar sites in Greenland to support a massive project called the Golden Dome Missile Defense System.
Ah, I see.
Yeah, with hypersonic weapons becoming a reality, the Arctic is the shortest path for a missile traveling from adversarial territory to North America. So Greenland is geographically indispensable to the Pentagon.
Right.
But crucially, General Guillot stated this radar expansion could be achieved using the existing 1951 defense treaty between the U.S. and Denmark.
And that single statement regarding the 1951 treaty was a masterstroke of Danish diplomacy.
How does that work?
To explain. The 1951 treaty originally allowed the U.S. to establish the Thule Air Base, which is now called Pituffik Space Base in northern Greenland, by convincing the U.S. military to utilize the legal framework of the 70-year-old treaty for the new Golden Dome radars. Denmark entirely bypassed the explosive domestic political issue of annexation.
Or changing territorial borders.
Exactly. They gave the U.S. the strategic military access it desperately desired in the Arctic, while Frederiksen got to keep her promise that Greenland remained Danish.
It's brilliant, pragmatic maneuvering. But it brings me to an analogy. Watching Denmark's foreign policy over the last 20 years, fighting brutal counterinsurgencies in the Middle East, offering up military access in the high north, it feels like watching a homeowner pay astronomical, ever-increasing premiums on a geopolitical life insurance policy.
That's a really good way to put it.
They paid the premium in blood in Helmand province, and they pay it in constant diplomatic anxiety over the Arctic. But if polling, as heavily cited in the DISA sources, now shows that 60% of the Danish public view the U.S. as an unpredictable adversary rather than a steadfast ally.
60% is a huge majority.
Right. And the U.S. is putting pressure on actual territorial sovereignty. Has the premium on that insurance policy finally become too high for the Danish public to stomach?
If we look at the trajectory outlined in the strategic analyses, the answer is definitively leaning toward yes. The premium has become exorbitant. But more importantly, the insurance company itself is no longer viewed as solvent or reliable.
The U.S. isn't seen as reliable anymore.
The guarantee of American protection is no longer taken as gospel. And that realization, that profound loss of faith, is exactly what is driving the massive paradigm shift in Denmark's grand strategy.
Because if the U.S. security guarantee suddenly looks fragile, transactional, and contingent on the whims of whoever occupies the Oval Office, Denmark has no choice but to look for shelter elsewhere.
They have to look closer to home.
They're looking to Europe. And Professor Sten Renning's thesis in the Danish Foreign Policy Review captures this psychological break perfectly. He literally writes, "The transatlantic vacation is over."
It's a phenomenal phrase.
Isn't it?
For decades, Denmark and frankly much of Western Europe essentially outsourced their hard security to the United States. They took a vacation from the brutal realities of power politics, confident that the U.S. Navy and the American nuclear umbrella would keep the world order stable while they built their welfare states.
Not now.
Renning argues that the vacation is violently over. Denmark has realized it can no longer solely rely on the American umbrella. They are being forced by geography and circumstance to actively shape and massively pay for European security.
And we saw the tangible turning point for this shift back in 2022. To understand the magnitude of this, you have to know that for 30 years, Denmark had a formal, legally binding opt-out from the European Union's defense and security policies.
Right, from the Maastricht Treaty.
Yeah, from the early 90s. They were a proud, cautious EU skeptic that refused to participate in EU military missions or defense procurement. But mere months following the full-scale Russian invasion of Ukraine, Denmark held a historic nationwide referendum.
And what happened?
The public overwhelmingly voted to abolish that 30-year defense opt-out. Overnight, they fundamentally changed their constitutional relationship with the EU.
And this institutional shift perfectly mirrors the remarkable personal political evolution of Mette Frederiksen herself.
Now she changed her tune completely.
Professor Marlene Wynn provides a brilliant, character-driven analysis of this transformation in the source material. When Frederiksen first became prime minister, she was widely considered one of the most vocal, stubborn EU skeptics in mainstream Danish politics.
I remember this. During the highly contentious 2020 EU budget negotiations, she notoriously and publicly referred to the proposed EU budget as GAC.
Which is a Danish word that translates roughly to crazy, ridiculous, or completely out of touch.
Right. She aligned herself as a hardline champion of what was called the Frugal Four. That was Denmark, the Netherlands, Austria, and Sweden, who aggressively demanded strict financial austerity and fought tooth and nail against deeper European financial integration.
But the think tank profiles note a complete 180-degree transformation since those days. She looked at the map, she looked at Washington, and she realized that being inflexible, frugal, and isolated in Brussels was terrible for Danish security interests.
So she changed tactics.
Today, the reports describe her as a master networker in the halls of the EU.
She has adopted a policy of extreme, almost ruthless pragmatism. As we touched on earlier regarding her domestic survival, she isn't bound by traditional left-right ideological alliances in Europe either.
No, not at all.
If she needs to accomplish a goal on externalizing migration and border control, she will closely align with Italy's right-wing Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni. But simultaneously, on the pressing issues of European strategic autonomy, defense manufacturing capabilities, and securing supply chains against Chinese monopolies, she aligns strongly with France's centrist President Emmanuel Macron.
She builds bespoke alliances based entirely on the issue at hand.
And there's one specific detail buried in the sources that truly illustrates how much Denmark's DNA has changed. Historically, Denmark has been one of the fiercest defenders of the national veto in EU foreign policy.
Which is a big deal for small countries.
Huge. The EU currently operates on a system where all 27 member states must unanimously agree before the EU can issue a foreign policy statement or enact sanctions. It's the ultimate shield for small countries to prevent big countries like Germany or France from dictating policy.
But now,
the sources reveal that Frederiksen is participating in informal, high-level groups alongside Germany, actively pushing to implement majority voting in EU foreign policy.
that is a radical, almost unthinkable departure from decades of Danish diplomatic tradition.
Truly unthinkable a few years ago.
It means Denmark is voluntarily signaling that it is willing to occasionally be outvoted, to lose its sovereign veto power, if it means the European Union as a whole can act faster, more decisively, and project power more effectively on the global stage.
They view European paralysis as a greater threat to Danish survival than being outvoted on a specific policy.
Furthermore, Denmark isn't just joining the European core, they are positioning themselves to lead it. Looking ahead to 2025, they are taking on what they are internally dubbing the climate presidency.
Oh, because Denmark will hold the rotating presidency of the Council of the European Union.
Yes. Concurrently, in a rare alignment of the stars, they will hold a non-permanent seat on the UN Security Council and chair the Arctic Council.
The diplomatic bandwidth required for a country of 6 million people to run all three simultaneously is immense. This is a diplomatic super year for them.
And the think tank reports highlight exactly how they intend to leverage this moment. They aren't just pushing environmentalism because it's morally good. They are actively weaponizing it as a geopolitical tool.
Interesting.
They are transforming climate policy, their dominance in wind energy technology, and green energy exports into a potent form of hard economic soft power.
I see.
They want to make Danish technology physically indispensable to the EU's green transition, irrevocably tying the economies of Central Europe to Danish innovation. It's a way of making themselves too vital to be ignored.
I see the strategy. But imagine this scenario. Denmark is acting like a stubborn tenant who has lived in an apartment building for 30 years, constantly complaining about the landlord, refusing to pay the extra fees for common area maintenance, and keeping to themselves.
Okay, I follow you.
But suddenly there's a violent break-in right down the street. Russia invades Ukraine. And the local police force, meaning the U.S., starts hanging up the phone when they call for help. So the tenant suddenly panics, buys the entire apartment building, starts organizing the neighborhood watch, and installs security cameras everywhere. My question for the expert analysis is this massive enthusiastic shift to the EU core driven by a genuine, newfound, idealistic belief in the European project? Or is it purely a cynical, panic-induced response to an unreliable America and an aggressive Russia?
It's an incredibly astute analogy, and according to Marlene Wynn's rigorous analysis in our source material, the latter is far more accurate.
So it is panic.
This sudden rapprochement and embrace of Brussels that we are witnessing is driven very little by sudden idealism or a newfound love of European federalism. It is driven almost entirely by Denmark's own raw existential security concerns.
Survival mode.
Exactly. The illegal, brutal invasion of Ukraine shattered the illusion of perpetual peace in Europe, and the growing instability of the transatlantic alliance shocked the Danish political system to its core. They moved to the center of Europe not because they suddenly love the architecture of the EU, but because it is the only viable, structurally sound shelter left in a rapidly gathering storm.
Which brings us to the final and perhaps most profound evolution we need to discuss. Because if Denmark is going to be a power player in this newly dangerous, militarized Europe, soft power, green tech exports, and clever diplomatic networking in Brussels are simply not enough.
No, you need hard kinetic power.
And the narrative now moves to how Denmark is fundamentally, physically restructuring its very society for hard defense, while simultaneously shifting its moral compass on the global stage. We are entering the era of what the strategists are calling pragmatic idealism.
Let's start with the physical militarization of Danish society, because the numbers here represent a paradigm shift that is hard to overstate.
Right, they were cutting budgets for years.
Exactly. After decades of actively cutting defense budgets to harvest the peace dividend and fund the expansion of the welfare state, a broad cross-party majority in the Danish parliament agreed to raise defense spending to a staggering 5% of GDP.
Wow. To put that in perspective, the NATO requirement that countries constantly argue over is 2%. Denmark is more than doubling that.
And it's not just a matter of signing bigger checks for equipment. It's about manpower. It's about the citizens.
Yeah, the sources from the Last Week in Denmark newsletters detail a massive societal overhaul of military conscription scheduled to start in August 2025. First, they are extending the mandatory service period for conscripts from 4 months to 11 months.
That's a huge increase in time.
But more profoundly, they are introducing absolute full gender equality into the draft, meaning 18-year-old women will be conscripted on the exact same legal terms and in the exact same numbers as men.
The societal shockwave of that change in a historically progressive and in recent decades somewhat pacifist-leaning Nordic culture is immense.
And the nature of the service itself is changing drastically too, isn't it?
Oh, completely. During the 4-month conscription era, soldiers were mostly getting basic training, painting barracks, learning first aid. Under the new 11-month model, conscripts are being assigned highly operational, critical military duties.
Like what?
The sources explicitly note they will be trained in preparing heavy artillery, guarding vital military infrastructure, and even helping equip and secure Denmark's incredibly expensive, highly classified F-35 fighter jets.
The entire posture and philosophy of the military is flipping. For 20 years, Denmark maintained an expeditionary force. A small, highly professionalized military designed to deploy thousands of miles away to places like Helmand Province or the Gulf of Aden.
Right, fighting abroad.
Now, the focus is strictly, urgently on territorial defense. They are preparing to defend the Baltic Sea approaches and patrol the Arctic. They are explicitly preparing their youth for the possibility of a war at home.
And this rapid military hardening at home is accompanied by a philosophical hardening abroad. This is articulated brilliantly in the official 2023 foreign policy strategy formulated by Lars Løkke Rasmussen.
The pragmatic idealism doctrine.
Yes. This new doctrine marks a deliberate, conscious departure from Denmark's traditional post-Cold War stance of value-based idealism.
Let's define what that means. Because for a very long time, Denmark was known internationally as a moral superpower. They used their vast foreign aid budget to promote human rights, build democratic institutions, and advocate for liberal values everywhere they went in the developing world.
They tied their aid directly to human rights metrics.
But the new strategy explicitly acknowledges that Denmark and the West as a whole can no longer afford to moralize to the world.
Lars Løkke Rasmussen made a stark, uncomfortable realization public in this strategy document. He pointed out that 2/3 of the global population live in countries that either explicitly support Russia regarding the war in Ukraine or stubbornly refuse to condemn it, choosing to remain neutral.
So the West is outnumbered.
The sobering reality is that the liberal democratic West is actually a minority bloc globally.
So Denmark is adapting its diplomacy to match reality. They launched what they call the Africa Century strategy. They are completely shifting their development aid away from moral instruction.
Where European diplomats tell African nations how they should govern themselves.
Right. They're moving away from that and moving toward equal, transactional, interest-based partnerships. To execute this, they are actively closing down Danish embassies in countries where the dialogue has narrowed or become unproductive.
And opening new ones, right?
Yeah, they are opening brand new, highly resourced diplomatic missions in pivotal nations like Senegal, Tunisia, and Rwanda.
It is a hard-nosed, transactional approach to diplomacy. They are looking for votes in the UN and access to critical minerals, not ideological purity.
And perhaps the most glaring, concrete proof of this new, unsentimental pragmatism, as prominently cited in the think tank sources, is the highly controversial decision by the government to officially lift long-standing arms embargoes on Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates.
Right. Denmark is now willing to sell advanced weapons and military technology to controversial authoritarian regimes if doing so aligns with Denmark's broader strategic, economic, and geopolitical interests in the Middle East.
At the exact same time, it is endlessly fascinating to see how this brutal pragmatism abroad contrasts with their deep domestic reflection on past values.
What do you mean?
Well, the sources mention a 70 million Danish krone investigation recently launched by the government into international adoptions that occurred from 1964 all the way to 2016. The state is rigorously investigating the legal and social conditions under which thousands of children from South Korea, India, Vietnam, and elsewhere were adopted by Danish families. They are actively acknowledging past systemic wrongs and seeking to reconcile with historical moral failings.
So you have a society that is meticulously auditing its historical conscience at home, even as it consciously hardens its moral stance globally to survive.
Exactly.
It is a profound duality. They are securing the domestic soul of the welfare state while applying a ruthless, realpolitik lens to the rest of the world.
I look at this concept of pragmatic idealism, and it reminds me of a strict, lifelong vegetarian who gets hopelessly lost in a freezing wilderness. After a few weeks of starving, the idealism fades, and they make the conscious decision that they have to hunt and eat meat to survive.
That's about survival.
It is a necessary survival mechanism, yes, but doing so fundamentally compromises their core identity. They live, but they are no longer the person they were.
Right.
My ultimate question to you, based on all these intelligence reports, is this. By dropping its moralizing tone, by seeking transactional partnerships with autocracies, by dealing advance arms to Saudi Arabia, does Denmark risk losing the very good power status, that unique, trusted international reputation that it spent decades carefully and expensively constructing?
That tension is the defining characteristic of Danish foreign policy today. The academic consensus in the Foreign Policy Review suggests a harsh truth. The concept of being a good power or a moral superpower is a luxury that only exists in a peaceful, stable, unipolar era.
Which we are definitely not in right now.
Exactly. In a multipolar, highly competitive, and increasingly violent world, international reputation is no longer based solely on moral purity or human rights advocacy. It is based on utility, reliability, and hard strength.
Does this country have technology we need? Can they secure the shipping lanes? Can they defend their airspace?
Precisely. Denmark is making a calculated bet that being a strong, indispensable, heavily armed partner to the EU, the US, and the Global South is worth the moral compromises they are making. They are basically trading their halo for a helmet.
That is a powerful way to frame it. Let's bring all of these complex threads together. We want to thank you, the listener, for joining us on this incredibly extensive, detailed deep dive into Denmark's geopolitical and domestic balancing act.
It really is a true masterclass in how a small state navigates a world entirely dominated by giants.
Remember, if you enjoyed this analysis, please follow the podcast and take a moment to rate it 5 stars on your app of choice so the show can reach even more people who care about how the world actually works.
We have covered a massive amount of ground today. We started with the fractured, unpredictable domestic politics of the 2026 snap election, showing how the welfare-first hybrid ideology completely neutralized the far right by co-opting their policies.
Right. Then we examine the high-stakes, secret diplomatic chess match over Greenland and U.S. missile defense.
We watched Denmark pivot away from an unpredictable United States and rush to the core of the European Union, abandoning its historic defense opt-outs and utilizing its wind energy dominance as soft power.
And finally, we saw a society literally rearming itself, doubling its defense budget, drafting its young men and women for 11 months of operational duty, and abandoning its historic moral high ground for a hard-nosed, survivalist, pragmatic idealism.
It's a complete transformation.
Which brings us to our final thought. As we look at all these rapidly moving parts, the massive military buildup, the incredibly strict borders, the transactional, unsentimental diplomacy, it is abundantly clear that Denmark is successfully building a formidable fortress.
They are definitely securing their physical safety and protecting their immense domestic wealth in a hostile, unpredictable world.
But I want to leave you with this question to mull over long after this finishes. In the relentless pursuit of defending the Nordic welfare state, and constantly tightening the gears, raising the drawbridge, and reinforcing the armor of that beautiful societal machine, does Denmark risk slowly sacrificing the inherent openness, the deep social trust, and the progressive idealism that made the Danish model so universally admired across the globe in the very first place? You can build the strongest, most heavily armored clockwork mechanism in the world to keep the time, but if you strip away the transparency and the beauty that made people marvel at it, you have to wonder if it's still telling the right story. Until next time, keep looking beneath the surface.